welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're tackling a topic that's incredibly important, but maybe doesn't always get the spotlight. The laws and policies around pesticide use right here in New York State.
Yeah.
You might actually be surprised by just how much these regulations impact our daily lives.
That's absolutely right. When you start digging into these rules, you find a really comprehensive system. It's all built around a core idea. How do we use these things responsibly?
Right.
To protect both people and the environment. It's much more complex than most people probably think.
And that's exactly our mission for this deep dive. We've, waded through a lot of New York State regulations to pull out the most crucial stuff.
Yeah, the highlights.
The illuminating information about how pesticides are managed. Think of this as your fast track to understanding a pretty vital and complex area.
And it really does affect everyone. Whether you're directly involved with pesticides or not.
Doesn't matter.
These regulations, they have a real impact on, say, the food you buy, the water you drink, the places you live and visit. So getting a handle on the basics is, it's really valuable.
Okay, let's get into it then. We'll start with kind of the bedrock principle.
Yeah.
Safe pesticide use.
Right.
The rules are very clear here. The main goal, the big one, is preventing contamination. That means keeping pesticides away from people, pets, wildlife, farm animals, and critically, any nearby water sources.
And what's interesting is it's not just about where you're applying it, but also the conditions when you do it, like wind, for example.
Right, drift.
Exactly, that's specifically mentioned. Applicators have to think really carefully about when to avoid, the pesticide drifting where it shouldn't.
Okay, and it's not just about avoiding getting pesticides where they shouldn't be. The regulations also insist on, strict adherence to the label itself.
Yeah, the label is key.
You can't just eyeball it, can you?
No, definitely not. The product has to be used exactly as directed on that label. Well, unless there's some kind of official state-level modification. But otherwise, stick to the label.
And that brings up the label availability, right? How easy does that info need to be to get hold of?
Right. And the rules cover that too. Anyone certified to apply pesticides.
Or supervising.
Or working under their supervision, like technicians or apprentices, they actually have to have a copy of the label.
Physically with them.
Physically with them for each pesticide they're using during the application.
Yeah.
And they need to be ready to show it if, an inspector asks.
Okay, here's a detail that seems really crucial, especially for protecting our water. Any equipment that holds pesticides and draws water from any source, pond, municipal supply, whatever.
Right.
It has to have what they call an effective anti-siphon device.
Absolutely vital. Yeah.
It stops that accidental backflow, right? Pesticide water getting into clean water.
Exactly. It sounds maybe like a small point, but it's a huge safeguard for our water sources.
Okay. So what happens after the job's done, those empty containers?
Yes. Disposal. New York has very specific procedures for how those have to be cleaned and ultimately gotten rid of.
All right, so for the non-combustible ones, the ones you had to mix yourself, not ready to use, there's this mandatory 3-rinse technique.
Yeah.
Or something state approved.
That's right, the triple rinse, or an approved alternative. It's all about getting as much of that residue out as possible before you dispose of it.
Makes sense. And once they're rinsed, how do you get rid of them? Does it depend on the type?
It does. It depends if they're returnable to the supplier or not.
Okay.
So non-returnable ones, you can dispose of them on the applicator's own property.
But carefully.
Very carefully. Only if it guarantees no contamination of soil or water. The other option is a permitted sanitary landfill.
And the returnable ones. Seems straightforward.
It is pretty much. You seal them up tight, no leaks, clean the outside.
And just give it back.
And return them to the supplier. Yeah, makes sense for those multi-use containers.
Okay. What about combustible containers? More options there.
A few more options, yeah, but with some important conditions attached.
Such as?
They can go to a sanitary landfill or to a special high-temperature incinerator that's been approved specifically for pesticide disposal.
But there's another option too, isn't there? For most of them.
There is, yeah. For most combustible containers, and here's a key exception, not the volatile hormone-type herbicides.
Okay, important distinction.
Right. For the others, they can actually be destroyed right there at the application site.
On the same day?
By the end of the day, they were emptied, yeah. But of course, you have to follow all the public health and environmental rules, especially about burning.
And those volatile hormone-type herbicide containers.
Yeah.
The exception.
Much stricter rules for those. They can only go to a sanitary landfill or be disposed of on the applicator's own property in a way that absolutely prevents contamination.
So no on-site destruction for those.
Correct. Too risky.
Okay. Now, what about leftover pesticides, the stuff you didn't use?
Good question. The regs cover that too, for small amounts.
How small is small?
Specifically, 10 pounds or less of dry stuff or 5 gallons or less of liquid.
Okay.
Burial is allowed, but with strings attached.
Okay.
Has to be at least 18 inches deep, covered with tightly packed soil, and critically located where it won't contaminate any groundwater or surface water.
And I bet it's even stricter for really hazardous stuff.
You bet. For pesticides classified as acutely hazardous waste, the limit for burial is much smaller. Only 1 kilogram, that's about 2.2 pounds or 1 quart per year.
Wow, tiny amount.
And also, this is crucial if the pesticide label itself says, do not bury.
Then you don't bury it.
Exactly. The label trumps the quantity rule in that case.
So for bigger quantities, or anything the label says not to bury, what are the options?
3 main routes. Return it to the original supplier, take it to an approved hazardous waste facility, which needs both EPA and state approval. Or participate in one of those state-approved pesticide cleanup days. It's all about making sure these things are managed properly, long-term.
Precisely. Which brings us to another really important point. Reusing pesticide containers.
Can you?
Well, the regulations are very, very firm on this.
I'm guessing it's a no for anything involving people or animals.
It's an absolute NO. You cannot use these containers for storing food, water, eating utensils, clothing. Strictly prohibited, zero tolerance.
Any other kind of reuse,
Yeah.
like for storing something else entirely.
Heavily restricted. You'd need explicit written permission from the state commissioner after the container has been properly decontaminated.
So the default is basically no.
The general principle is, once it held pesticides, treat it as a potential risk. Always.
Makes perfect sense. Okay, let's switch gears a bit. Let's talk about people who might be working with pesticides, but under supervision.
Right. Supervised individuals, technicians, apprentices.
The regulations have specific safeguards for them, don't they?
They do. And what's notable is the emphasis on safety training before they handle anything.
Before they even start.
Before any pesticide application under direct supervision.
Right.
And the certified applicator is the one responsible for making sure that training happens.
And this isn't just a quick be careful chat, I assume.
No, not at all. The training has to cover specifics about the site, general pesticide safety, how to use PPE correctly, personal protective equipment.
Including respirators if needed?
Including respirators, yes. And also information about restricted entry intervals.
Which are?
The time periods you have to wait before it's safe to go back into a treated area, REIs.
Got it. And beyond just the training itself.
Well, the certified applicator, or maybe the business owner or manager, if the applicator isn't in charge, they also have to supply the relevant safety info, the REI details, and all the necessary PPE.
The actual gear.
The actual gear, yeah.
Right.
Anything that goes beyond just normal work clothes as specified on the pesticide label, it's about making sure everyone has both the know-how and the equipment to stay safe.
Okay, very thorough. Let's move on to who is actually allowed to apply these things. Certification.
Right. New York's system of applicator certification and supervision requirements.
So the general rule is commercial application, private use of restricted pesticides, and even selling restricted pesticides.
We need certification.
You need to be certified and have a valid ID card. That's the baseline.
But like most comprehensive rules, there are exceptions.
Always exceptions. Like what?
Well, for instance, certified commercial technicians can use general use pesticides without needing the full commercial applicator certification.
Well,
And people who aren't fully certified yet, like technicians or apprentices, they can apply pesticides if they're working under the direct supervision of a certified commercial applicator.
but with limits.
Definitely with limits on what they can do.
And it's important to understand the difference between commercial and private applicators, isn't it?
Absolutely. Commercial applicators are certified in specific categories like structural pest control or turf or agriculture.
And they stick to those categories.
They're limited to applying pesticides within those specific areas they're certified for. Private applicators, on the other hand,
They're usually farmers.
often, yeah, they're certified to use restricted pesticides in categories related to producing agricultural commodities, usually on land they own or their employer owns.
But they can't do commercial work for hire.
Correct. No commercial application for hire.
Now, that term direct supervision keeps coming up. Is it always the same thing?
No, it's not one size fits all. The level of supervision needed actually depends on the risk associated with the specific application.
Makes sense. So higher risk means closer supervision.
Exactly. For certain higher risk jobs, like applying termiticides under foundations in some cases,
Okay.
most uses of fumigants, the majority of aquatic pesticide applications, anything where the product label itself requires on-site supervision,
Right.
and any pesticide application at sensitive places like daycares, schools, hospitals, if it's being done by an apprentice,
For all of those.
on-site direct supervision is mandatory.
And what does on-site mean in this context? They have to be right there.
Physically present at the location where the pesticide is being applied, yes. And they need to be able to have direct voice contact with the person they're supervising.
Close enough to talk.
Right. And for fumigants, it's often even stricter, sometimes requires continuous direct observation.
Wow. Okay. And for lower risk applications.
For applications deemed less risky, off-site direct supervision is sometimes allowed.
But the supervisor still has responsibilities.
Oh, definitely. The supervising certified commercial applicator still needs to make sure they can be contacted by the apprentice or technician within 30 minutes.
Okay. Reachable.
And for aerial applications spraying from planes or helicopters, radio contact is required between the supervisor and the pilot.
Good to know. And even with supervision, there are still things apprentices just can't do.
That's right. Apprentices face certain restrictions. For example, they can't do certain types of termiticide jobs, most fumigations, or any aerial application. Some things require full certification, period.
Okay. So becoming certified isn't just signing up. You have to meet criteria.
Absolutely. For both commercial and private certification.
How does someone get commercially certified? What are the routes?
There are several paths, actually. You might need documented experience as a technician, sometimes combined with specific training courses.
Or coming up through the apprentice ranks?
Or experience as a registered apprentice, yes. Private applicators can sometimes transition to commercial. There's reciprocity with some other states.
So if you're certified elsewhere?
You might be eligible, yeah. And even folks with a background in pesticide sales or, a strong technical background might qualify if they can pass the required exams.
And if you're already certified commercially but want to add more categories, like you do lawns but want to do structural pests.
Generally, you need to show at least 1 year of practical experience in that new category, or complete a department-approved training course for that category, usually at least 12 hours long.
But sometimes related categories are easier.
Yeah, there are some exceptions if the categories are closely related, like maybe certain agricultural categories if you already have others.
Okay. What about private applicator certification? What do you need for that?
Generally, you need to be at least 17. And you need some recent experience using pesticides in the categories you want certification for.
How much experience?
Often, completing one full growing season counts as a year for ag categories.
Alternatives.
You could complete a comprehensive 30-hour training course instead, or maybe hold a relevant college degree, agriculture, horticulture, something like that.
And if you were already a commercial applicator?
Prior commercial certification can also make you eligible for private certification.
Got it. And what about becoming a certified commercial technician?
Similar requirements in some ways. Usually need to be 17. You typically need to complete that same 30-hour training course we mentioned, or have a relevant science degree and pass the exams,
Or experience?
or have at least 2 years of verifiable experience as a registered apprentice and then pass the technician exams.
Okay. And the apprentices themselves? What are the rules for them starting out?
To become a registered apprentice, you need to be at least 16.
And then training?
Yes. They have to get a minimum of 40 hours of supervised practical experience, plus at least 8 hours of formal instruction before they can apply general use pesticides under off-site supervision.
And who decides if they're ready for that off-site work?
Ultimately, it's the certified applicator supervising them or the registered business employing them. They have to determine if the apprentice is competent to do the job safely and effectively.
Okay, lots of checks and balances. So how do you actually get certified, the process itself?
It all hinges on a proctored examination process.
Taking tests.
Taking tests, yeah. You apply, and then you usually have to pass 2 separate written exams.
What are they?
A core exam covers the fundamentals, safety, laws, general principles, and then a category-specific exam for each type of application you want to do.
Unless you're coming from another state.
Right. Unless you're eligible through reciprocity, then the exam requirements might be different.
And what if you don't pass?
Happens. There are rules for that too. If you fail the core exam twice, you'll probably have to take additional state-approved coursework before you can try again.
And the category exams.
Fail one of those 3 times in a row, you might have to retake both the core and that category exam again.
Ouch. Okay. Are there deadlines involved?
Yes, definitely need to watch the clock. Once you pass the core exam, you generally have 6 months to pass at least one category exam.
And after passing everything.
You have another 6 months to pay the certification fees.
And if you miss those deadlines.
You might have to retake the exams. Start over, essentially. And yeah, there are fees for the exams and for the certification itself.
So assuming you jump through all those hoops, pass the exams, pay the fees.
And then the State Department of Environmental Conservation, the DEC, issues you an official ID card.
And that card lists your categories.
Exactly. Shows what you're certified in. And the certification is typically good for 3 years.
How do you renew?
Pay the renewal fees, basically. And you need to have a record of satisfactory performance, meaning you haven't had your certification suspended or revoked.
What if it lapses? You forget to renew.
There's usually a 3-year grace period. Within those 3 years, you can typically reinstate it just by paying the fee.
But after 3 years?
After 3 years expired, you'll likely have to go through the whole exam process again, core and category exams.
Back to square one.
Okay.
Now, what if someone breaks the rules or is unsafe? Can certification be taken away?
Oh, yes. The DEC has the authority to deny an application in the first place, or suspend, or even completely revoke an existing certification.
For what kinds of reasons?
A number of things. Lying on your application, getting convicted of a felony, misusing pesticides in a harmful way,
Okay.
engaging in fraudulent practices related to pesticides, failing to comply with the laws or regs, showing you just don't have the knowledge or experience,
Falsifying records.
falsifying required records, absolutely, or violating federal pesticide laws like FIFRA.
Does the applicator get a chance to defend themselves?
Yes. Importantly, anyone facing denial, suspension, or revocation has the right to request a formal hearing.
They get notice.
They get at least 20 days advance notice of the proposed action and the reasons why. It's not an arbitrary process.
Good. So the standards for getting certified, commercial or private, it really comes down to proving competency.
Exactly. Through those written exams and sometimes practical performance tests,
Based on DEC standards?
based on departmental standards, covering general pesticide knowledge and category-specific knowledge.
And for private applicators, anything specific?
There's a particular emphasis on having practical working knowledge of common pest problems and integrated pest management, IPM, as it applies to agriculture in New York.
Okay. Now let's pivot to maybe the less exciting but absolutely vital part. Paperwork.
Record keeping and reporting. Can't escape it.
Critical for tracking and accountability.
Absolutely. Registered pesticide businesses and certified commercial applicators have pretty significant record-keeping duties.
What kind of details do they need to track?
For every single application, they need to record the exact pesticide product name, the quantity used, the dosage rate,
How was applied?
the method of application, spraying, baiting, whatever, the target pest they were going after, and the precise date and location of the application.
And they have to keep these records.
For a minimum of 3 years, and they have to be ready to show them to the DEC if asked for an inspection.
And it's not just keeping them, they have to report too.
Right. Registered businesses also have to submit annual reports to the DEC.
When do those due?
By January 15th each year, covering all the applications from the previous calendar year.
What's in the report?
Details on the total quantity of each pesticide product used, identified by its unique EPA registration number.
What about private applicators? Do they keep records too?
They do, but their obligations are primarily focused on the restricted use pesticides.
So not necessarily general use?
Not generally for record keeping, no. For restricted use, they need to track what they purchased, the crop or site treated, the method used, and the dates.
And keep those for?
Same deal, minimum of 3 years, available for inspection.
Okay. Are there rules about identifying equipment or people?
Yes. Commercial pesticide application equipment and vehicles used to transport it need to display numbered ID stickers from the DEC.
Any exceptions?
A few limited ones for very small handheld gear and for personal vehicles just carrying small amounts.
And the applicators themselves?
They get personal ID cards they're required to carry while working.
And can the state check the equipment itself?
Yes, the commissioner can inspect commercial application equipment at any reasonable time
And force repairs?
and can issue orders requiring repairs or changes before it can be used again. Ensures equipment is safe and working right.
Okay, let's shift focus now to something you mentioned isn't strictly enforced yet, but is important: storage.
Right. Pesticide storage guidelines. These are voluntary, aimed at minimizing risks.
To people and the environment.
Exactly. It's about best practices for risk reduction, not currently legal mandates for enforcement, though that could change. And the guidelines differ a bit for businesses versus individuals.
So for registered businesses, what do the guidelines recommend?
Things like physically separating pesticide storage from offices, homes, livestock areas, food or feed storage.
Makes sense. Security.
Secure access is key, yeah. Preventing unauthorized entry. Also, impermeable flooring with containment like a curb or a sump to catch spills.
Ventilation. Temperature.
Proper ventilation, temperature control, definitely highlighted. They even reference National Fire Protection Association, NFPA standards for more detail.
What about bulk storage, like those big mini bulk tanks?
Additional precautions there: locking inlets and outlets when not in use, storing them on impermeable pads with berms big enough to hold leaks,
Secured areas.
fenced or walled areas around the storage site, yeah. And routine inspections are strongly recommended.
And inside the storage area, how should things be organized?
Proper segregation is a big one. Keep incompatible products apart to prevent dangerous reactions.
Like flammables away from...
Flammables are right, yes.
Yeah.
Herbicides separate from insecticides and fungicides to avoid cross-contamination. Reactive chemicals isolated.
And individual containers, how should they be stored?
On impermeable shelves or pallets off the floor. Labels need to be intact and readable. Containers tightly sealed. Periodic checks for leaks or damage.
What if a container is damaged? Can you transfer it?
You can transfer it to a new container if necessary, but that new container must be properly labeled with all the original info, and critically, you can't resell those relabeled products.
Okay. Safety and emergency stuff, what's recommended?
Having PPE readily accessible but outside the storage area,
Why outside?
so you can get to it without entering a potentially contaminated space if there's a spill or fire. Also, easily accessible eye wash stations and safety showers.
Hand washing,
Yeah.
spill kits, fire extinguishers.
Routine hand washing facilities, yes. Readily available spill kits appropriate for the chemicals stored. And the right type of fire extinguishers for chemical fires.
And training for staff.
Mandatory staff training is emphasized. Safe handling, spill response, proper PPE use.
What about communication? Who needs to know what?
The storage area manager should give employees safety info, explain the segregation rules, make sure OSHA and NYS right-to-know posters are up.
Notifying the fire department.
Annual notification to the local fire department is recommended. Types and quantities stored, seasonal changes. Inviting them for a site visit is a good idea too.
Emergency plans. Inventory lists.
Preparing and distributing an emergency response plan, definitely. And keeping a current inventory list stored somewhere separate from the actual storage area.
First aid.
A readily accessible first aid kit, again, located outside the storage area, and staff need to know how to use it.
And mixing loading areas. Special recommendations there.
Protecting water supplies with anti-siphon devices is key. Using vapor removal equipment when handling concentrates. Separate, secure storage for empty containers waiting for disposal. And a system to collect and store rinsates the rinse water above ground for recycling or proper disposal.
Okay, that's for businesses.
Yeah.
What about private or individual applicators? Similar ideas.
Many similar principles, yeah, but generally maybe less extensive requirements suggested. Still recommend structural separation for storage, impermeable floors with containment.
Spill stuff, fire extinguishers, PPE outside.
Yes, accessible spill control, fire extinguishers, PPE outside, locked and posted storage area, annual fire department notification, and a basic fire plan.
Segregation.
Labeling, segregating by function and hazard. Proper relabeling if transferred, still no resale.
Mixing loading areas. Bulk storage.
Using bermed mixing, loading, cleaning areas containing rinsates. Similar precautions for bulk storage, impermeable floors berms, locked tanks, secured areas, containment.
Water. First aid.
Accessible emergency and routine wash water, and a first aid kit outside the storage. It mirrors the business guidelines, but maybe scaled down a bit.
Okay. Let's talk about backflow prevention again, but the policy details.
Right. The state clearly defines an effective anti-siphon device. It has to be either a device approved by the NYS Department of Health, DOH, or an air gap separation.
And for pesticide use specifically, what does DOH approve?
Only two specific types of assemblies: reduced pressure principal assemblies, RPZs, and reduced pressure detector assemblies, RPDAs,
Plus the air gap.
plus the physical air gap separation, correct?
And how is that air gap defined? It's just a space.
It's defined very precisely: an unobstructed physical break open to the atmosphere between the water supply pipe outlet and the highest possible water level in whatever tank or container you're filling.
How big a gap?
The vertical distance has to be at least double the diameter of the supply pipe, but never less than 1 full inch.
And that physically stops backflow.
Completely. There's no physical connection for water to flow back.
Got it. Okay, finally, let's circle back to reporting, but dig into the real nitty-gritty requirements.
Right. We mentioned records, but the annual reports from commercial applicators and technicians are quite detailed.
What exactly do they have to report for each application?
A lot. The EPA registration number for the product, the specific product name, the total quantity used, the exact date,
Location.
precise location, street address, and zip code, the dosage rate applied, the method used, the target pest,
And where on the property?
and the specific place within that location: lawn, interior, foundation, etc. That level of detail is crucial for tracking.
Are there any times commercial applicators don't have to report?
A few limited situations, yeah. For general use, pesticides applied on their own property that isn't used for food or residence, but not their own home.
But restricted use still needs reporting.
Generally, yes. Restricted use applications almost always need reporting, unless maybe they hold dual certification as private applicators too for that specific use.
What about donated services? Like spraying for a church for free?
Oh, that must be reported, even if it's general use pesticides. Donated services count as commercial application for reporting.
Can businesses report for their employees?
Yes, registered businesses or agencies can submit consolidated reports for all their certified commercial applicators and technicians.
Even if someone didn't spray that year?
Can include everyone employed, yeah, but not apprentices. They usually report under their supervisor.
And what if an applicator just leaves pesticides for the customer to use later?
That's treated as a sale, not an application by the applicator, so the applicator doesn't report that part.
How do you report locations without street addresses? Like a park or a field?
Still need to be as specific as possible. County, municipality, and zip code.
And distinguishing between spraying a building versus the lawn around it.
Important to specify, yeah. Application to the structure versus the surrounding property or right-of-way.
Are there any shortcuts for businesses doing lots of the same applications? Like marinas?
For places like marinas treating many boat bottoms with the same product, they can report daily totals for that specific product.
But they still need the individual records.
Still need to keep the detailed records of each application, yes.
What about huge spraying operations, like for mosquito control?
Right. Large-scale, community-wide spraying, like for West Nile. There's a special allowance because databases struggle with that volume.
How does that work?
Reporting can be done by county, municipality, zip code, but they also have to submit a detailed map to the regional DEC office,
Showing what?
showing exactly where they sprayed, and just as importantly, any areas they intentionally didn't spray within the larger zone.
And the amount used still needs to match.
Absolutely. Total undiluted pesticide used has to line up with the area treated and the label rates. They need documentation for that, submitted within 2 weeks.
And again, keep reports and records for.
3 years minimum, available for inspection.
And private applicators remind us of their duties.
Record keeping for restricted use pesticides. And they need to provide site-specific info to researchers if requested, coordinating with planting harvesting.
And when they buy pesticides.
When buying restricted or general use pesticides for ag crops, they have to provide the seller with the location of intended application. Helps track usage.
And businesses reporting for employees, they handle it all.
They can, yes. Might need a separate list if it's complex, but the individual applicator is still ultimately responsible for ensuring their use gets reported unless the employer explicitly takes care of it.
What if you didn't spray it all in a year?
Still generally need to submit a no-activity report if you're a certified commercial applicator or technician.
Some pointers on filling out reports. Product name. Quantities.
Use the registered product name, not just the active ingredient. Report quantities accurately: liquids, dry weights, sometimes up to 4 decimal places. Follow rounding rules. There's guidance for products without standard measures, pre-mixed stuff, even aerosols. You report the net weight of the pesticide content.
Location again for no address.
County, municipality, zip code.
Is this information public? Can anyone see who sprayed what where?
Generally, no. The submitted information is kept confidential. Applicator names, addresses, price data aren't publicly disclosed.
Exceptions.
Specific exceptions for the Commissioner of Health and authorized health researchers for public health studies.
Can people customize the reporting form for their own records?
Yes, you can add extra columns to the annual report form for your own daily record keeping, as long as the original 9 required columns are still there and clear, offers some flexibility.
Okay. All these rules need teeth. Let's talk enforcement.
Right. Enforcement objectives and priorities. It happens when improper use occurs, and it's needed for public health, the environment, and frankly, fairness.
What are the main goals of the state's enforcement policy?
3 main objectives. Get strict compliance with the rules, establish a visible enforcement presence to deter violations, and apply sanctions consistently across the state.
How does the DEC make people comply?
They use their full statutory powers. That means administrative penalties, fines, actions against certifications or registrations, even potentially criminal prosecution. The goal is to make compliance the better option.
When do big penalties usually get levied?
Typically, when the violation was willful or negligent, when the violator gained an economic advantage by breaking the rules.
Or caused harm?
Or caused tangible harm to public health or the environment, yes. Also, if it takes a lot of administrative or court effort to get them to comply.
What's this enforcement presence idea?
It's about being visible, actively pursuing violations, big ones and smaller ones, based on priorities to remove any economic benefit from non-compliance, punish offenders, and require cleanup or correction. Deters others.
And consistency is key.
Very key. Committed to applying sanctions consistently across all regions. Uniform minimum responses for most violation types ensure fairness and efficiency.
How do they prioritize which violations to go after first?
They use a 3-tier system based on risk.
Tier 1, highest priority.
Tier #1, yes. Emergencies, potential for human or animal injury, exposure contrary to the label, significant environmental harm, or unregistered products having a wide impact. Serious stuff.
Tier 2, still high priority.
Tier #2, high priority. Things like property damage, illegal sale or possession of restricted pesticides, violations of notification or lawn marker rules, certification and registration violations, having no record-keeping system at all, commercial lawn care violations, or being a repeat Tier 3 offender.
In Tier 3, secondary.
Clear #3, secondary priority. This includes record-keeping issues where a system exists but it's incomplete, misuse of general-use products without property damage, selling unregistered general-use products, and basically all other violations not in Tier 1 or 2.
And the regulations mention who does the enforcing.
Briefly lists the DEC personnel involved, yes.
Finally, some key definitions for enforcement. Misuse. Contamination.
Right. Misuse is basically any use contrary to the law, regulations, the label, a permit, or an order. Contamination is the presence of pesticide outside the target area in harmful amounts.
And they're independent.
Importantly, yes. You can misuse without contaminating, and contamination can happen even with proper use if conditions are wrong.
And they also define specific outcomes of misuse.
Yes. Definitions for misuse resulting in property damage or environmental damage or unknown exposure, and misuse resulting in human injury or resulting in human or animal exposure contrary to label. These help categorize the severity and guide the response.
So wrapping this all up, it's clear New York State has a really comprehensive system.
Incredibly detailed, yeah. A whole framework of laws and policies for pesticide use.
Covering everything from how you spray it, to how you get rid of the container, to storage, training, certification.
Exactly. And the consistent goal underpinning all of it is protecting public health and the environment. That's the driving force.
And as we've heard throughout this, these aren't just rules for applicators or farmers. They impact everyone.
Absolutely. They touch the food we eat, the water we drink, the places we live, work, play. It's all connected.
Which leaves us with a thought, maybe something for listeners to consider.
Yeah.
Given how complex and detailed all these regulations are, how can we, as individuals or communities, stay informed? And how do we make sure these rules are actually being implemented effectively and enforced consistently, to really protect public health and the environment?
It's a crucial question, finding that balance, isn't it? between the benefits pesticides might offer in certain situations and the absolute necessity of the precautions laid out in these laws, how do we ensure that balance is maintained in practice?
Absolutely. Well, if you want to dig even deeper, we definitely encourage checking out the source materials and resources from the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation. They have a lot of info available.
Definitely worth a look.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.